I'll tell you what, as much as I travel and attend conferences throughout the year, this is the only one where I see everybody here at the morning session, let alone the fact that it's 7:30, 8 a.m. when we gather for breakfast. It's wonderful to see, feel, experience such energy in the room, and I'll tell you what, we greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much for being here bright and early. I hope you had a good time last night. We're in Chicago, so there's plenty of fun things to do, and take advantage of them tonight. Just make sure you're here at 8 in the morning again tomorrow. We have a special treat this morning. No, I'm not referring to our mystery guest speaker who will be supplementing Jim Sensenbrenner during the lunch session, but I'm referring to something a little bit earlier this morning. I'm told that there's a protest group that is planning on disrupting this conference. So let's see. Disrupt Climate Change Deniers Conference. Gathering 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Hilton Hotel. Apparently they thought the IPCC was meeting here today, but they'll have to settle for us. But it's important to keep in mind that if and when they try to do anything stupid, unusual, we do have security. That's why they're here. Their whole intention is to provoke something. So just remain calm, rational. Direct them to where the closest local public showers are if you like. I hear it's about 2 blocks west of here. You can do that, or perhaps maybe critique their protesting style and tactics. So you can say, well, that was a good line, but you could have done a little better with this, and see how they respond. Or also, we could perhaps, in light of yesterday's panel with Dr. Shaviv's talk, we can start chanting "Cosmic rays, cosmic rays, cosmic rays." They'll go, huh? So anyway, but thank you for being here this morning. We have a special treat. Some of you may recall that approximately 2 months ago, there were several dozen NASA former scientists and astronauts who wrote a letter to NASA urging them to stop their global warming propaganda. And then in a reply, Walid Abdelati, who is the chief scientist there, in a written statement said that he thinks that the folks that expressed that sentiment, the scientists and astronauts, should participate in public forums rather than try to shut down discussion. So, that being the case, we thought this is wonderful, great. We have our conference coming up, and here we go. So we invited some of the scientists, astronauts here to speak. I sent multiple letters to Dr. Abdelati encouraging him, asking him, inviting him, and or any of his staff that would like to attend if he can't, to come here and let's have that constructive discussion that he's so encouraged. And I never heard back from Dr. Abdelati or anybody at NASA other than the scientists and astronauts who penned the original letter. So we're going to hear from them this morning, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Leighton Stuart, who will be introducing these wonderful speakers. Leighton Stuart is chairman of the Plants Need CO2 and CO2 is Green nonprofit corporations, and the Institute for the Study of Earth and Man at Southern Methodist University. He is a geologist, environmentalist, author, and former energy industry executive. So actually knowing something about energy, that's considered a bad thing, except in this conference, that's a wonderful thing. So his full bio is in your program. I encourage you to read that. I don't want to take any more time from this fantastic panel. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Leighton Stuart.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that promotion. It's Mr. Leighton Stuart. I've got a lowly Master of Science degree from a long time ago. Anyway, I'm particularly proud to be up here and participate with this panel of American heroes. We have the people up here that launched those spacecraft, and we have those up here that flew in those spacecraft. And folks, whether it's 18 years from now, 1,800 years from now, 18,000 years from now, these folks are going to be known as the first people to put another human on another heavenly body. And today, I'm real happy to see that they're concerned about what's being said about the science and the economics, of global warming. Now, following a couple of empirical-based presentations that I was privileged to make to about 100 of these people, I found out that they were all concerned by what was being said by NASA, today's NASA, because today's NASA was making a lot of statements of certainty and things that just didn't ring true to some of these science people who, as we all know, are supposed to be skeptical of some of these things. So in the course of that, seeing that they were all concerned, I just said, why don't you guys send a letter to NASA and let them know what you're concerned about? They looked at each other and said, that's a good idea. And boy, did they send a letter. For those of you that haven't seen the letter, I have it here, but I'm not going to ask you to try to read it because it's too small to read, so let me tell you what's in it. It says the science is not settled, the statements of such certainty are not substantiated, empirical evidence suggests that anthropogenic global warming may in fact be false, and that you folks at NASA are putting the reputation of NASA, of NASA's employees, of NASA's ex-employees, and even the reputation of science itself at risk by making these firm statements. So anyway, as James mentioned, we got a reply from Wahid Abdullati, the chief scientist up there. He says they make no such statements about any of their research that they're doing at NASA. And as James also said, only 8 days later, Wahid went before a United States Senate committee and testified that sea level might rise between 6 feet and 8 inches this next century, but that the 6-foot rise was in what is commonly considered the most likely scenarios, where the 8-inch rise, which is what it's been doing in the past, was less likely. So if that's not an alarmist statement, I don't know what is, because a 6-foot rise in the next 87 years would clearly be a problem for everybody. So these guys decided it was time to send a second letter, and they sent a second letter. And that second letter is going to be up there, and you're not going to be able to read it either, so I'm going to tell you what's in it. The second letter says, Abdullati made alarmist statements of astounding imprecision, totally inappropriate statements with NASA's name attached to it. NASA's reputation has been put at further risk, and a protracted discourse on this is not in NASA's best interest, because we think they'll lose at every round on this. And so they ask for NASA to simply go back and commit to their old level of excellence. Okay, I hope this turns out to be a very important meeting, because in addition to the letter that they've sent out, we want you to know that these scientists sitting down here put together a team, and I'm going to let one of them tell you what the team's up to more in a minute. But as you could see from some of the things that were on the slide earlier, if this thing will back up, yep. There we go. They believe in achievement through excellence, and they also had a motto that hung on the wall at the Space Center that said, "In God we trust, and all others bring data." And so that's what they're going to be looking at, is data. So if any of you are lucky enough to get invited by these guys to come and address them, don't come without data, because that's what they're going to be looking for. But they will ask both sides about that. I mention this fact that they have this team going because I'd like to encourage any of you experts in the audience that would like to help these guys get up to speed as soon as possible on your area of expertise to please offer to help them. We have a new website set up. It's called The Right rightclimatedata.com. And so you can send that data, forward it to them there. You can give them your business card as the next day and a half goes by, but help them out if you can, because they are clearly in need of some of your expertise. Now, why would you want to do that with a bunch of guys that are not trained climatologists? And Tom, I'm leaving you out of that because you are. But anyway, why do you want to do this? Let me quickly give you the reasons that I think that you want to help these people out. This is a very high-profile group, and whatever they come up with is they rate the quality of data that's going into models, as they rate the quality of data that's going into paleoclimate reconstructions. They're going to get an inordinate amount of attention. The things that we go out there and bang our heads on for years, these guys are going to get more attention in 1 year than we can get in 5 years of our effort. So it's to our mutual interest for them to come up with the right ideas. They're no longer NASA employees, and none of them are employees of the fossil fuel industry, so they reek of objectivity. And unlike so many other groups that are out there, so far from being an individual researcher or even a team of modelers or team of climatologists, they're going to be in an interdisciplinary team that's going to include physicists, chemists, astrophysicists, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, geologists, mathematicians, climatologists, and meteorologists. And that, folks, is how research can really be done well. That's why they had the success they had at NASA in putting these men on the moon. The team members have proven analytical and risk assessment skills. They plan to do this thorough examination that I mentioned about paleoclimate reconstructions, which is where we get a lot of our empirical evidence that we look at. And they're going to be assessing data from both sides. They already have. And they want the science to speak. They don't want to just hear these political statements spoken. How many of you out there would be willing to help these guys? Hey, I like it. Show of hands. That's great. Thank you very much. Yep. Okay, with that 5-minute summary of that, let's get on with introducing these guys. Walt here was working on his last year of his PhD thesis when he was chosen to be an astronaut. But true to the scientific method, he has been an outspoken critic of those who say that the science is settled. Let's go to Jack. Jack, I guess it's Dr. Senator Jack, because this fellow's done everything. He's been studying climate science for years. He was a moonwalker, a rock finder, and a rock toter. Oh, there's Walt. There's Jack. They look somewhat younger. Look at one of the rocks that Jack found. The module commander said, Jack, that ain't going to fit. Anyway, then we've got Hal down here. Hal is the current team leader of this right climate stuff team, and he can solve all kinds of problems. Brilliant guy. And so I just asked the media to leave these guys alone up here so they can go get some results. That's what we want to see coming out of them. Tom is our token ex-NASA meteorologist, but don't let that fool you, because he brings data in from all directions. He respects everybody's opinion. He's been a great cheerleader for the team, and particularly for this interdisciplinary approach. That's going to be good. Anyway, all of them are fair game up here for questions, and they're fair game for the next day and a half as you have a chance to go up and introduce yourself and talk to them. And with that, let me get around here and start this off and ask Walt. Walt, with NASA having contributed to so much science in the last 50 years, so much to science in the last 50 years, why are you concerned about their role in climate science today?
Thank you, Leighton. You didn't mention I'm just a dumb fighter jock. Well, we have been receiving a lot of criticism since we spoke out on this particular issue. And I decided that since most of what my conclusions about climate science have been drawn from the data that you people in this room here have produced. I saw some interesting new charts in the last couple of days, as a matter of fact, and I'm very impressed with what I get when I'm here. I say I was here in 2010, and even more impressed with what I'm seeing today. Anyhow, that's part of the scientific argument, and I'm not here to talk about the arguments for and against climate science. I draw my conclusions from the data that you produce. I also criticize some of that data, so you got to take it both ways. And I decided that what I was going to do is put together a little paper. I'm not going to have any slides, nothing you have to watch up there, and all I have to do is make sure I got enough light so I can see my notes on what I have here. I've been very impressed also in the last couple of days. I thought that what I was doing was be kind of off the issue of the climate science, where Heartland does such a fantastic job. But I've noticed, Tom Harris, he's talked about the concern for liberal skeptics. Todd Wynn, the regulatory battles in Washington, D.C. And last night, particularly appropriate when we listened to President Klaus, and I think that led into what I have to say. It's a concern about the same thing. In the little paper that I've put together, I titled it "The War on Human-Caused Global Warming," because I believe that that's what we're involved in. It really is, and it's because of the implications of what can happen if we lose that particular war. And I'm not talking about the science. NASA, there's no question about it, NASA has contributed a lot to our society, to our economy, and to our science. And it's done that through the efforts of thousands of us over the years, over decades actually. And we worked there, and I can tell you the reputation that NASA generated up until fairly recently on all their science was outstanding. And it was not political. I can remember back in the 1960s, I made the mistake of wearing a campaign button to the office one day, and I was asked to take it off because it was political statement in the office. And I think NASA has been very influential with both the media and with the public over the years. And today, when you look at that, and you were asking me why I was interested in doing this, they have several NASA scientists, James Hansen and several others up there, and the NASA website. If you ever go take a look at the NASA website, it pretty much presents the alarmist case on human-caused global warming. Alarmists focus on a very small temperature increase over the last 200 years, since the Little Ice Age, if you will. And they now, of course, refer to it as climate change, and nobody in this room would disagree with climate change. It's there all the time. And through a lot of that effort, the media has now bought into something called consensus science, and this feeds the public human-caused global warming. They feed this to the media as a accepted scientific theory. Their claim, I'll read you a couple things here. It says, every major national and international scientific organization, from the World Meteorological Organization to the American Geophysical Union, of which I used to be a member, you're probably still a member, recognizes that climate change is real and caused by human beings burning fossil fuels. And those of you sitting out here in this room, you're identified as climate denialists or fake experts, if you will. And those of us who signed the letter to the NASA administrator, we're described as having, quote, not an ounce of climate expertise. And that is one of the nicest comments, if you bother to read it. So, there is the scientific issue. But I have to say this. There's also the practical issue, and that's the one that affects us all. And that's the consequences of actions taken based on bad science. We're in a war. It's a war to avoid the lowering of our standard of living, and the economic destruction of the world as we know it. And that's what President Klaus, I think, was referring to last night as well. And it's hard to be optimistic about winning that war. And what I'm talking about this morning is really to ask you to help join in that, not the war that you've already won. And that's the climate. I think that the war on the science involved here is being won very rapidly. This is an issue that's being thoroughly exploited by the alarmists. And this war is being fought, I believe, on 4 intellectual fronts: the scientific front, the media, the public perception front, and the political front. Climate realists or realistic scientists have been fighting the battle on the scientific front, and they are certainly winning the scientific case. Everybody here would agree, I'm sure. But the real battle today is the media front. The media plays the most influential role in the public's perception and the political front as well. We need to focus more of our attention on the battle for public understanding of these issues. The media, the public, and politicians, they share very little scientific or technical background. There are some rare exceptions. And they show very little interest in gaining that kind of expertise. The media is significant in this battle, and look what they are being fed by the alarmists. Alarmists are pushing human-caused global warming as if it were an accepted scientific theory. The reality is, well, and I'm sure you people know that, back in the late 1980s, a small group of individuals became concerned about our temperature and what it might do in the future. Human-caused global warming was dreamed up. I hesitate to call those people back in those days scientists, because they apparently had no appreciation for the process by which their hypothesis about future temperature change could achieve scientific acceptance or rejection. They postulated that we humans were responsible because of our activities since the Industrial Revolution, about 200 years ago. Skeptics of this new hypothesis were characterized as non-believers and deniers of the obvious truth. Instead of proving their hypothesis, we were charged with disproving it. And that's what many of you have been working on ever since. What is the alarmist hypothesis challenging anyway? Well, if you go back and take a look, empirical data collected over several centuries led to a provisional theory of climate change. Scientists have long known that the sun, the oceans, and variations in the Earth's orbit are the principal drivers of climate change. While we may not understand all of the mechanisms or the interactions involved, after hundreds of years, it became the de facto theory of climate change. It was this de facto theory that was challenged by a very few alarmists back in the late 1980s. Climate science realists, like yourself, you know all of this. Our challenge at this stage in this war is to bring the media and the public back to reality. Saying that humans control the Earth's climate is simple-minded. But it is easier for the public to buy into that than the real, more complex causes in this debate. Alarmists are not fighting with their data. They're resorting to alarmism, so-called consensus, politics, and money. They have seized the high ground, and they're very consistent in their tactics. I think that they own the semantics involved in here. Human-caused global warming, not too flattering. It changed to AGW, or anthropogenic global warming. Now it's climate change. And we skeptics are now against climate change. Alarmists have completely abandoned the scientific process, and they've transformed their unproven hypothesis into another new invention, this so-called consensus science. It's time that we and the people in this room fight them on their own turf. There are things that we should all be doing. And I'm appealing to scientists. I know a lot of scientists think that some of these things I'm talking about are kind of beneath their dignity. But if you're going to communicate to these people, the media, that's influencing all these other things, you need to give some thought to this. In our writing and our speaking, we should always refer to the issue explicitly as human-caused global warming. I read papers from some of you people out here today, and you've bought into it. You refer to it as climate change also. We should emphasize that it is not synonymous with climate change whenever that comes up, because everyone accepts it. The public at large thinks that you're talking about the same thing. And please, make the point that the issue is not climate change. The issue is the cause of climate change. Now, all of these things I know you know, but it's not apparent to the public and to the media especially, and the media is the one that's influencing the public. Whenever it's possible, explain the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. Tell your listeners to don't just listen to the alarmists. They frequently confuse cause and effect. Tell them. I never make a talk about this. I don't speak too much on this particular subject, but I never do it without asking people to look at the data themselves. Now, some of that data is not all that complicated to look at. You've done a beautiful job in some cases. Sometimes it gets pretty sophisticated. We don't have to have them understand the sophistication, but the overall picture we do. Leo Szilard said the following: if all you know is what someone has told you, you have no basis to form an intelligent opinion. That's what science is about. I just mentioned, I always tell listeners to not just buy what others are telling you, including myself. They shouldn't just believe it because they were told. They should ask themselves the following questions when they look at the data. 1, is there any reason to be concerned about today's temperature or today's temperature trend? 2, does human-produced carbon dioxide play a significant role in global temperature levels? 3, is there any reason to believe that carbon dioxide and temperature levels are the ideal ones, the ones that we have today? Are they ideal? And can humans have a significant influence on the Earth's temperature? The answer to all those questions, obviously, is no. But I ask people to go look at that for themselves. So I appeal to those of you who are real climate scientists here today, because I'm not one, to adopt some of these same tactics, especially when you're dealing with the media. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Walt. Appreciate that. Jack, the federal government has become the dominant source of funds for many of these areas of scientific and engineering research, and particularly now for climate scientists. How do you think that happened?
Well, thank you, Leighton. Appreciate your initiative in getting us all together and asking these questions. I have to immediately, if we can go back to there we go, give Pat Michaels joint authorship on the title at any rate. I didn't realize yesterday that he was going to use basically the same concept of a government science complex that has developed. And I'll just talk more about how did the funding and politics of this come about. The science and engineering research funding of the United States of America prior to World War II was largely corporate and philanthropic. There were exceptions. The National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics was a government-funded effort, except that it was a cooperative effort with industry to transfer technologies in aeronautics to the private sector, as well as to advance them for the military. Agriculture, beginning with the creation of the land-grant colleges, was also a joint federal, state, and really industry or farmer effort. But for the most part, it's what I have said. Federal government funding became dominant during and after World War II. The Cold War, Cold War I, I call it. I think we're in Cold War II now, as some of you already know. Apollo and subsequent space research really did accelerate the involvement of the federal government in science. And Cold War II that we're in, that we have been in since Cold War I, have continued the government's dominance in the funding of research that's related to our national security. And then nuclear and alternative energy has been largely a government-sponsored effort, except for the final commercialization of nuclear energy, which truly did become commercial. Alternative energy is another thing entirely. Major exceptions still exist in the competitive industries of energy exploration and production, mineral exploration and production, electronics, communication, transportation, pharmaceuticals, and crop improvement. So the government hasn't taken over everything. It's just that in the particular area of concern here, we find it as a dominant player. The capture of I think one of the most essential elements of this discussion is the capture of K through 12 education by unions and the political left. We've been sleeping on that one, and it's time to think about how we get back into the control of that. The de-emphasis of STEM, history, English, constitutional government has all occurred as a result of that capture. Lower standards overall have been put into place. The capture of the most advanced education administrations and faculties by the left, indoctrination rather than commercially marketable skills or voter maturation has been the result. Never-ending quest for federal funding sources. Many of you have colleagues that spend most of their time writing proposals and trying to figure out how to satisfy the whims of whoever is going to evaluate those proposals. And that, whether they believe what they're saying or not, they still feel that they have to do that in order to fund the students that they're trying to educate. Capture of the nation's media by the left has certainly happened over the last many decades. If it bleeds, it leads, and that's equivalent to scaring people. That seems to be the primary motivation of most media, certainly our local media in New Mexico. That's what you see. And if you can scare people, well, then it's going to be on the television. The national media has ceased to be a form of continuing education. There really is no, for the mass of the American people, and I think most people throughout the world, media is the only form of continuing education. And we have to figure out another way to do that, as Walt has already said so well. Capture of scientific societies and publications by the left is clearly taken place. And it's amazing to me when you read Science or Nature or other publications of that kind, just how seemingly oblivious they are to the hypocrisy of some of their editorials and other things, and what is said in the articles. Peer review is no longer peer review; it is review by like-minded individuals, and that is not what science should be based on. Pure peer review has to be objective, and it is not for the most part today. There has been a corruption of scientific research, loss of constitutional focus in congressional and executive actions related to scientific research, funding of federal research without enumerated constitutional grounds. That is basically the common defense. That is the constitutional rationale, direct or indirect, for the federal government being involved in scientific research. Funding of regulatory activity without enumerated constitutional or legislative grounds and or independent scientific review. Again, the peer review of government regulations is done by like-minded individuals, not by a truly objective and independent source of such advice. Constitutional amendments by judicial action. The Constitution lays out very clearly how it is to be amended. Unfortunately, that has been superseded now by action in the courts. Rise of science is legitimate pork barrel spending. And I have to admit that when I was a manager at NASA headquarters in 1973 and 4, I participated in that. The idea was to make sure that congressmen and senators throughout the country had a vested pork barrel interest in NASA funding. And that's where it is today. That's why you see the kind of de facto space policy, which is not space policy, that we have, is because it has become a means of legitimate pork barrel spending. Ideological rather than national interest leadership from elected and appointed officials, that has been going on for some time. And research proposals based on what the government wants to hear rather than what constitutes good science. Even more serious now, and it's been growing for a long time and has probably been with us ever since the founding, crony capitalism has now joined with crony unionism and has silenced many voices of threatened interests. We see that in the ability to fund groups like the Heartland Institute and Heritage Foundation and others, and that fear is now being utilized by the political left in order to intimidate not only individuals and corporations, but families. I've been through that myself. Many of you have already been through that, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, what happened to the watchdogs of science? Well, traditional government research agencies become part of the problem, and there's a list is there: NASA, NIST, USGS, DOE, NSF, etc. Now, I don't consider the EPA as a legitimate research organization or even having a constitution. Having constitutional grounds for its existence, but so it's not on that list. But even the legitimate agencies that you can tie back to some direct or indirect interest in the common defense, they have become part of the problem. No question about it. Academies have been corrupted by their dependence on federal funding. The National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and the Academy of Medicine, Institute of Medicine, really are funded by the federal government. They're funded by the studies that federal agencies ask them to do. And so they have a conflict of interest in whether or not they can be objective in talking about the interests of their funding agency. Professional scientific societies have been captured by academia dependent on federal dollars. All of you are members of various professional societies, and you find, I think, if you're anything like the ones I'm a member of, that independent scientists have less and less influence, if in fact now no influence over the statements, the policies, and the actions of these societies. The independent scientist organizations are largely frozen out of national and scientific media. One of the most important results of that has been the rise of scientific blogosphere and conservative think tanks, and we just need to expand those outlets. We need more of them. And the ones that we have are obviously doing a heck of a job, and we just need to encourage them to do more. Independent working scientists have lost influence in their professional organizations, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, particularly in terms of what we might do. In the short term, we've got to keep pushing back, as you all have, and meetings like this do, pushing back on the behalf of traditional science. What is that? We observe, we hypothesize, test severely, modify or change their hypotheses, test severely again, modify or change hypotheses and so on. That is what real science is all about, observation leading to hypothesis. And Walt is exactly right. Let's remember the difference between a theory and a hypothesis, okay? We all grew up, most of us who have gray hair, I guess, grew up with there is a specific distinction between the two. Let's try to remember that, what that distinction is. Push harder and smarter for media objectivity. I really don't know how we're going to do that, but long term, we have to recapture the K through 12 education system. That's the long-term problem. I know the Heartland Institute is deeply involved in that, independent of their activities in climate, and we've got to encourage them and many other organizations, state legislators, and others to get the K through 12 education back into an objective and knowledge-based context. I do want to encourage you to look at what some of the states are doing. Governor Jindal and his activities in Louisiana are particularly remarkable in the current environment, and it may be possible actually to do that, but it's a long-term effort that everyone has to be committed to indefinitely. You can never let up on that particular one. Form competitive professional organizations for non-academic scientists and engineers. I don't know whether that's possible or not, or whether it even could be sustained, but it is clearly something that we have to be worried about, because I don't know how we regain control of organizations like the Geological Society of America, the AG, the American Geophysical Union, Meteorological Society, and so forth. And finally, continued public outreach. Each of us, in following up on what Walt has said, need to commit a time tide where we're going to work with the public to try to understand and simplify, but still understand what this is all about and why it's not just climate. Climate just happens to be the current political horse that the statists are riding. They're going to pick up another horse as soon as it's clear they have lost this battle. They'll pick up another one, and we've already heard about some of those here at this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jack. Hal, while you're on your way up here, I want to mention that there are two other team members in the audience. We've got Jim Peacock out here. Yeah, good. Right up there. And also Pam Luftmuller. Stand up. These are two more members of that team, so introduce yourself to them and strike up a conversation. Hal, you're the leader of this Right Climate Stuff team, so come up here and tell us two things. Tell us why you signed that letter and a couple of things the team's going to be doing.
Well, thank you, Leighton, and thank you to the Heartland Institute for inviting us here to this really fascinating conference. I'm getting to meet some of the heroes I know from the internet, and I do appreciate the indication of support that so many of you gave. I guess I need to give a little history. I first got interested in this AGW issue. I was looking for my former boss from McDonnell Douglas on the internet, doing a Google search, and his name popped up, and it was on a petition that has been mentioned here before, a petition of scientists and engineers who did not agree with the hypothesis of human-caused global warming. And I verified it was him because his brother's name was right next to him, so this has got to be a good match. I said, well, I want to sign this petition. I certainly can't agree with it yet. I don't understand why people think there's a global warming problem. I found the people that put out the petition, surprisingly, gave me the address of my boss who had signed the petition, and he was in retirement, and I needed him for a consulting job. So that got me interested, and I began to follow the issue more closely. About a year ago, a group of NASA retirees in the Texas Hill Country get together every year for a little reunion, And Leighton was asked to speak to us. And he had recently written a book, Fire, Ice, and Paradise, which had a lot of great empirical data in it. And he really got that group stirred up about, here's the data, where's the global warming problem? And I happen to be on the board of directors of the NASA retirees group, and that group in the Texas Hill Country said, Hal, we want you to go back and make this an issue for our Retirees Association. So working with our board of directors, we agreed to host 2 symposia on this issue, and we did that last fall. We intended to have a symposium where we would have speakers from both sides of this argument speak, but we couldn't get any warmists to agree to that format. They all had good excuses, but Walt Cunningham agreed to come, and Leighton agreed to come, and Tom Weissmuller agreed to come, and Alex Pope, one of our members, had done his own research, and he gave a talk on what he had found in looking at a lot of data that was on NOAA websites and NASA websites. So we wanted to be fair. So after that stirred a lot of interest beyond the Texas Hill Country. So we then said, well, we need to have another symposium to bring academics in to talk to us about this problem. And Jim Peacock, who has some connections down at Texas A&M University, got Dr. Andrew Dessler to speak, who is, in my view, one of the most left-wing warmists we have in the science community, and also Dr. John Nielsen Gammon, who is the Texas State climatologist, and another climate researcher from the University of Houston, Dr. Barry Leffer. And those 3 came and gave us an afternoon of discussion about, why they thought there was a global warming problem. And that generated enough interest in this NASA retiree group that said, well, what are we going to do next? And our retiree organization said, hey, wait a minute, we want to focus on space stuff. You guys that are interested in this climate thing, y'all go do your own thing. So I was asked to organize this group. So we have about 27 now members of our study group and we picked a name, and I think, Peacock, did you come up with that name? The right climate stuff. And so we've been meeting fairly regularly. We've had really entertaining lectures from different people that we knew in the Houston area. Dr. Singer has agreed to come speak to us when he hopes to be in Houston in a few weeks for a paper on Mars. He's going to come talk to us about his work in climate science. Of that team of about 27 people, I was counting up last night, over a third have doctorate degrees. I think more importantly, probably 2/3 have extensive experience, probably more than 40 years experience like I do, using science to make critical decisions involving human lives, which I think that experience is missing from the climate discussions today. We have people wanting to make terribly impactful decisions without the kind of process that we at NASA are used to going through before you make such a decision. And with the quality of models that we use to make life or death decisions, our initial look shows that the climate models aren't even in the same league with what you want to use. So we're interested in how models are used in the decision-making process. So what we plan to do is take an independent look. We've used a couple of reports from the ICCC that helps contrast where are the real issues between the warmist and the realist, and let's focus and see how we would come out on the points of contention, the focus points of contention. So we plan to write a white paper, at least the first one, that states our position. And not everyone on our team is a skeptic, or in fact, our Texas state climatologist is somewhat skeptical, but I think he pretty much believes that we do have a global warming problem. But he has been amazing in his patience and support with us, and sending us to the peer-reviewed literature that we can look at. So anyway, we're just getting started. We would welcome any of you that have a chance to come down to Houston and talk to our group. They're a very inquisitive bunch. We are used to working in a team where we have to rely on experts from different specialties, but we work together for so long that we have tremendous respect and trust for each other, and that's the way we like to do our research. It's usually done in a big team environment. So that's the approach we're taking with pouring through the climate data and trying to reach our own conclusions about, do we have a problem? If we do, what would be appropriate steps to take? So anyway, I want to leave time for Tom here.
Great. Thank you very much, Hal. Okay, Tom, why did you think a second letter to NASA was necessary? You were the big spokesman on that deal.
Thank you. Well, as many of you know, on March 28th, we sent a letter asking NASA to refrain from including unproven remarks in public releases and websites. Now, why did we do that? You know, the NASA tradition, and one that I grew up in, was based on hard data, research that was proven, that allowed us to accomplish great things. And the people you see here on the platform were an integral part of that. They grew up with that attitude. Point to Hal here, who led the research team that managed to get the resonances out of the fuel delivery systems in the shuttle so that the rocket wouldn't break apart. So all the successful shuttle flights we have here are due to what that guy did. And that kind of focused research and ability allowed heroes like these two to rocket into the heavens with the hopes of humanity with them on the same rockets. It's a fantastic set of achievements. That's the NASA that I grew up with. And I think these guys deserve a heavy round of applause now. So, on the 11th of April, Dr. Walid Abdullahi, the chief scientist of NASA, very respectfully responded to us and said, as an agency, NASA does not draw conclusions and issue claims about research findings. Well, that's pretty good. It came straight from the NASA policy directives. But 8 days later, at a Senate hearing, Dr. Abdullahi did exactly that. He concluded that sea level rise within the next 87 years projects, and I'm going to quote now, within a range of 0.2 of a meter, it's about 7.5 inches, to 2 meters, about 6.5 feet. That's the range. With lower ranges less likely, while the highest values were based on the warmest temperature scenarios commonly considered for the remainder of the 21st century. Well, we stated in our second letter that the range and imprecision of this conclusion is astounding. All right? Commonly considered, now here's where we get a little bit testy. All right? He says, is this science bipolar? Okay? If hard data points to a provable rise, it should be stated with its probability. And then we ask the question, We said, can you imagine one of your predecessors, Dr. Thomas Paine, he was the administrator during the moon landings, declaring that our Apollo 11 lunar lander's target is the Sea of Tranquility, but we may land within a range that includes the crater Clavius. Now, for geography reasons, the Sea of Tranquility is in the equatorial region of the moon, and Clavius is near the South Pole. All right? So we said we're not trying to stifle discourse, but undisciplined commentary lacking in precision is wholly inappropriate when NASA's name and reputation is included. So we said, again, as Leighton said before, we don't want to have a protracted discourse here, but a commitment from you, and now we're talking to the administrator of NASA, Charlie Bolden, who's also an astronaut, all right, for you to excel or exceed the agency's reputation for careful reliance on rigorous science and accurate data is what's warranted. So we ask him to join us in encouraging the rest of the agency to do the same. And then we ended it by saying, waiting to do so is not an option. And we signed it. And by the way, we didn't delay in sending this letter because our waiting to send it to him was also not an option. And so we managed to get 41 of the original 49 signers. The others were either out of the country or unavailable. One person said, I'd rather not sign this letter, but I agree with you guys anyway. And the letter was hand-delivered a week and a half ago. We hope sincerely that the agency takes this to heart. Charlie Bolden is an astronaut. His life was relying on that hard data and accurate research, and that's what NASA's reputation should go back to. It hasn't been there now, as you've heard. We're going to work on trying to change it. So that's why we wrote the letter.
Right. Thank you, thank you. We're about at our time to open up questions to the audience, and we'll have at least 20 minutes for that, for those of you that have questions. Let me mention one thing, though, at the end of this before I start that and ask Tom probably one more question. This is really, really important, because if we finally convince everybody that carbon dioxide is not the major cause of climate change, there can be some real good things that come out of that. And these are the real good things that can come out of it. The positive fallout. There would be a general greening of the earth as CO2 levels rise. Ecosystems and habitats would become much more robust. Plants and trees would use water much more efficiently. Food production per acre would increase, which means less pristine land would have to be cut down for people to plow it up. Trillions of dollars would not have to be spent chasing a non-problem. Subsidies for current, uneconomic, unreliable energies could be shifted to alternative energy research. Economic recovery would be faster and stronger. Fewer jobs and industries would move overseas. And we could stop paying countries for having sent them the best airborne fertilizer in the world that's provided them more food for decades. Anyway, with that, Tom, I think you got cut a little bit short, so let's open up the open discussion here and ask you, from your standpoint as a forecasting meteorologist with a good track record, I might say, how do you think CO2 plays into the grand scheme of things here?
Well, CO2 and climate have been linked to sea level rise and all kinds of terrible things on the planet. Well, Leighton happens to be on the right side of the issue here. He has a website called planetsneedco2.org. This is what it looks like, worth looking into. But I want to talk about the disconnect between CO2 and temperature. And if I can move this slide over, maybe we can. There's Walt. There we go. If you look on the left side, you'll see the Mauna Loa CO2 readings. It's quite accurate. The reason it has a sawtooth pattern going up is because we have seasonality in the northern hemisphere, and these are northern hemisphere CO2 readings. So it kind of spikes up in the spring, drops because the plants absorb CO2 during the summer. When the leaves fall, the CO2 rise again. But the trend has been rising very, very steadily. But take a look at the chart on the right. It's the temperature chart for the last 15 years. It is basically a flat line. I mean, there are reasons for it, and maybe if I have time I'll get into that, but this is within a 0.2 of a degree centigrade, and we are just going flat across. There is no connection between the recent temperature, land surface temperatures, and CO2. If you go to my website, which is colderside.com, you see a more extensive research on that, because I go back into the Middle Ages, where we had a medieval warm period going up, a little ice age, a couple of other little spikes down. So wide variation in temperature and a 280 parts per million flat CO2, so flat you could almost sight along it until the 1800s when CO2 started rising. So there have been times in the past where CO2 goes up at the same rate as temperature, and there's times when there is a total disconnect. Well, there really is a disconnect. The percentage of CO2 in the atmosphere just can't influence other things that affect CO2. And one of them, the greatest one, is albedo. Albedo is reflectivity. When you have snow on the ground, you have 70% of the sunlight comes in at all wavelengths and shoots back at all wavelengths. Now, some wavelengths are intercepted by CO2, particularly the longer ones. So if you have sunlight hitting bare ground, converts some of that radiation to infrared, and CO2 manages to heat trap it in this radiative forcing model. But the shorter wavelengths go right back up, and if you have snow on the ground, the incoming sunlight pierces through the CO2 and pierces right back up. The energy is lost to the Earth, and the Earth gets cooler. Well, most of you know last year we had a fairly extensive snow cover in Asia and Europe, so much so that albedo has already affected the land temperatures to the point where this year is going to be even colder than the years that you see on that chart. So other factors than CO2 have a greater influence on our climate. La Nina, El Nino also has an effect. If I have time in the questions, maybe I'll get into how that works. But right now I want to move a little bit further and talk about some of the sea level problems we're having. This is a graphic that you see. It's designed to sell books. It's actually on the cover of Heidi Cullen's alarmist book. You're never going to see that, folks. That is unrealistic. And Dr. Abladi saying that sea levels are going to rise 2 meters by the end of the century is, the probability there is a 0, all right? There is some sea level rise. In fact, lately we've seen the opposite. We've seen sea level fall. These are the satellites that measure sea level. There's a bunch of them. Some of them are European satellites, some of them are American, some of them are joint US-French. You notice the trend toward the end there, and all of a sudden the pink line that happens to be the ENVISAT, that's the European satellite, shows a marked decline. Now, the American satellites also show a decline in sea levels. By the way, why is sea level declining? Well, we're actually taking moisture out of the oceans and leaving it on land, particularly in Antarctica, but also in northern Canada for parts of the year, and certainly Asia. But you notice the American satellites show a higher sea level reading. Now, why is that? Well, it turns out that the University of Colorado is adding a factor into the sea level readings that they called GIA. This is the Glacial Isostatic Adjustment. Okay? It's an adjustment. It's not real sea level. I call it vapor. Now, but it has some validity, by the way. Isostasy is the balance between land masses, and basically you have to look at the Earth's skin as a very thin, wrinkled apple. Now, sea water and ice are very heavy. If you have a cubic meter of ice, it weighs a ton, 2,000 pounds. If it's a cubic meter of water, it's 2,240 pounds. That depresses the ground, and when the giant glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age, they lifted those tons and tons and tons of megatons of pressure off the surface, particularly in places like Norway, which were under glaciers, northern Canada. Well, when that was lifted, the ocean next to it is still filled with water. That presses down and actually makes the ocean basin slightly larger. So you could use GIA as a good analog for ocean volume, but not sea level. Sea level is measured from satellite sensor to ocean top. That's pretty complicated, and if you want to get into some of those complexities, I'll do them in the questions and answers. But the fact is the sea level is not rising to that GIA adjustment. 0.3 of a millimeter a year they're putting on there. It is fake. And that's why you see the difference between the European measurements and the American ones. But the sea levels are still going down. In the face of declining sea levels, how Dr. Abladi can say that within 38 years, we are going to triple the rate of sea level rise, to me is just astounding. Anyway, that's my sea level talking. Leighton, it's all yours.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Okay, it's time for you folks out there to have a go at these gentlemen. I think I saw a hand down here real early.
Hi,
yeah, and if you can direct your question to one of these guys, that'd be fine. Otherwise, they'll all four answer it at one time.
Well, this question is for all of you. On the media objectivity point, I want to note how dramatically things have changed in the past 40 years with the rise of ubiquitous talk radio. Most of the country, you can turn it on at 9 in the morning and it goes right till midnight, wherever you are. You've got alternative media with the Fox News. And I want to suggest that as a model for the rest of these problems that you've identified with these professional agencies. I very much favor the idea of forming alternative agencies and alternative publications. You have science, nature, you need your own publications. And over time, it'll prove that which one is more objective, and it'll make a huge difference over time. So I wanted to get your comments on whether you thought that really was a good strategy. I want to urge that myself.
Jack.
Does this? All right, works. Peter, I agree. I think we've got to explore those possibilities, and the alternative, so-called alternative media, is being very, very important and increasingly critical, and hopefully it'll become increasingly critical in many of the other areas besides climate, where these are issues. We can't forget, though, that most Americans, and probably most people throughout the world, if they are looking at television, are not seeking news. And this has been a case for decades, that the majority of Americans are looking at entertainment programming of one form or another. And if they get news, it's being formed by what their perceptions from that entertainment programming. And that is the majority. That's where the electorate is getting their so-called news most. And during an election year, of course, that superposed on that are the ads, and you know the quality of information that comes out in political advertising. So it is a complex problem. It's one which I think we all have to begin to sit down in some of these small interactive groups that we were used to having at NASA and try to figure out a solution to the problem, or at least some options that we can pursue and maybe move up to higher management.
Great.
I would urge a caution.
Whoops.
I didn't touch it. I would urge a caution on that, because you never know when you're looking at alternative media whether you're getting the straight scoop or not. That's why it's increasingly important that when, even in the regular media, those of you who are experts, that you address those people. Your job is to educate those folks. You don't have to worry about the other scientists. They know what you're doing. Those guys that are against you, they know how good your data is too. They may not want to publicly acknowledge it, but the media, you need to still influence.
Yeah, thank goodness for the talk radio alternative media here. I've done about 150 radio interviews in the last 2.5 years. And I ask these hosts before we go live, I say, are you seeing any change in your audience out there? And they all unanimously say, yes, we are. They're getting much more skeptical about this area. So at least that's one thing that is good. I've heard some people talk about the possibility that we need to have another journal out there, but I have no idea who's going to do that or whether that's going to ever get any legs or not. But we sure need it because we don't get any reasonable articles out of Science or Nature anymore. Fully agree with you. Okay, next question. Here's one back here.
Hey, to Tom, please. Did you send a copy of the second letter to the Wall Street Journal or Scientific American or Discover the way you did the first?
Well, we thought it would be inappropriate to send a letter out before the administrator and Dr. Abladi had read it. So the letter was delivered a week and a half ago. This morning, it's going to be released on the internet and then published, republished by anybody else who wants to read it. But no earlier than this morning. It was done at 8 o'clock this morning.
Yeah, but listen, with the bloggers that we have in this room, I figure it'll be widely distributed in about 20 seconds.
Leighton, I want to give credit to the bloggers here for being that alternative media for me. I think most of the good climate discussion is going on in the blogosphere. Even before papers get into peer-reviewed journals, they're discussed and dissected in many excellent blogs, and we're fortunate to have those people here today.
Yeah, you bet. With Morano and Watts and Harris and all that, it's going to get out. Okay, next question.
Yes. Yeah, Stan Goldenberg, Hurricane Research Division. And I want to comment on the issue of persistence and strategy. I mean, that's what you men are trying to do and your whole group is trying to do. And I'm just going to comment, and I know you all want to comment on what I say, is two areas I deal a lot with the TV meteorologist during interviews. And I honestly cannot think of a single one that when I bring up the issue of AGW that they're not on the same page with us here. And one recently, I think it was Steve Jervey, WFLA in Tampa, was of course very concerned with the likes of Heidi Cullen and that kind of things. But a lot of them might be afraid to speak up. I spoke to some of them. I said, try and get it, because it's usually not the main topic of the interview. I'm talking about hurricanes and different kinds of stuff, but I get it in any way I can. And but I challenge them. I say, I challenge you to get this stuff on the air. I mean, there's probably some of them are afraid for their jobs. But I think any way with the media, suggestions for getting through to the media people. I'll also mention one other quick thing with the schools is someone contacted me who was revising a textbook on marine science. And when he first wrote it, when he first did the textbook, he was convinced about everything about AGW and since then learned better and was asking for help to get the changes in there. And they blocked him at every level. Up and down to revise those things. So just suggestions on getting through. You mentioned the media. Suggestions maybe from you all on getting through to the meteorologists in the media.
Yeah, good. Well, anyway, I'm so proud of these folks because they have led the duck on this of really challenging people at high levels in the administration. And I'm hoping we may see more of that from some other
implicit in
areas.
Leighton, implicit in the question and comments is the weapon in Walt's war, the weapon the other side uses, which is fear. And Mark Stevens, that some of you know who he is, he recently doubled down on advertising on Rush Limbaugh just to make a point. And he refers to it as terrorism. And if you call terrorism trying to instill fear in people to not do things they otherwise would do, then that's what we're dealing with.
Go ahead, Walt.
I'd like to add also, many of you know Gordon Fulks out from Oregon. I had an email this morning from Gordon where he mentioned that an Alaska meteorologist, it says at least one, but it could be more, have been notified that they'd be fired if they didn't immediately cease opposing global warming hysteria in their off-duty postings on it. And I can tell you this, that I've had it communicated to me on the sly, if you will, that since that letter went in and it had my return address on it, I've been told I'm being investigated by the administration. So I'm just saying anything that goes on like this, they no longer are sticking to the scientific case. It has to do with a whole lot more than that, and that's why it's important to us.
Yeah, the media likes the scare stories. The environmental extremist groups like to scare the money out of your pocket. And I guess the other four groups in there are all rising to the Russian poet Pushkin, who said, "Where there is a trough, there will be pigs."
You mentioned all the different scientific disciplines that you wanted to include in your review. I would like to remind you that the issue is sometimes whether warming is going to hurt people. So it might be a good idea to have biologists, and you talked about some of the biology issues, but you didn't mention any biologists or physicians or medical scientists, because I do think they need to be included in this effort on your part.
Fully agree. Anybody want to
Yeah,
comment
John,
on that?
I hear you. However, our first objective is to really address the question of CO2. And so I don't know how far this will go, but we would like to do something rather shortly, and that's not easy with everybody being retired and wanting to enjoy retirement. But so our first objective is really to answer the question, is CO2 having a harmful effect on our atmosphere that we need to be concerned about? And once we get into that, I mean, a lot of guys want to go off and say, well, here's what I think is causing global warming. And we realize that's a much bigger issue than just addressing the CO2 problem. I agree. I've come up with a way to get any temperature I want. But my question is, okay, what's the ideal temperature that you want? And I think that's certainly a function of what latitude you live on. But I agree with what you're saying. It's just further down the road for our group.
People are naturally finding the latitude they want, because you gentlemen yesterday did a great job of talking about longevity and everything, and who Duchesne and Moretti out at a couple of liberal schools on the West Coast, Cal Santa Barbara and Cal Berkeley, came up and said that just the people that have voluntarily moved to lower latitudes, like from the Northeast to Florida, Texas, Arizona, have raised the longevity in the entire United States by about up to 7% just by moving into a climate that on the average year long is almost 20 degrees Fahrenheit warmer, and they're living longer and raising the entire longevity of the United States.
One of the other things, though, is that the endangerment finding is based upon endangerment to the human race. And so it ultimately is important for us to keep that target in mind, even though the CO2 target is the one that we can deal with early.
Yeah, we weren't particularly focused on the EPA and its schedule for comments. I'm hoping that you experts can respond in time for the comment period on their regulations.
Excuse me. Go ahead. I was just going to say, do we have another question out there? Here's one back here.
All right. Hi, guys. This comes from our online audience. This is from Jed from Dublin, Ireland. His question to the whole panel: why are there no young NASA scientists with the guts to speak out? Do you think they are intimidated into keeping quiet?
They're all still getting paid.
Yeah. Let me just
They're being practical.
I think what we are saying is what a lot of I won't call it NASA scientists, but the NASA people at large, most of them are technically oriented, and they look at this the same way as we do in looking at data and analyzing it. And I think that they feel the same way, but they cannot speak out. I can tell you this, that the whispered warning I got that I was being investigated, not necessarily by NASA, incidentally, outside of NASA, but the warning I got was from inside NASA, and before they hung up, they said, keep up the good work.
Also, I'm going to make a point here that the question brings up, but may not be totally relevant, and that is that NASA is, as an average age, is twice as old as it was when Walt and I and everybody was working. The Apollo was a young person's program. The average age of the engineers within NASA and in most of the contractors was somewhere between 25 and 30 for most of Apollo. We got to remember that these kinds of efforts, these extraordinarily complex efforts such as Apollo, require the imagination, the courage, the innovation of young people, and the stamina of young people. And even though there are young people in NASA, the average age is now just under 50, where for us it was generally around 25.
Astronauts too today.
Same for astronauts.
Yes.
Yeah, they're older.
Yes.
By the way, just one of the things that one of the fallouts of sending our first letter were emails that we received from people, including one I received from someone at the EPA, saying, "I wish we could do the same kind of thing because the endangerment finding is junk science."
Good. Here's another question.
My name is John Kerr. I'm the Inconvenient Skeptic blogger, and I have a book on that. One of the greatest challenges I have, and I think this is where you guys could be really helpful, is in freeing the data, because I'm a chemical engineer in research and development in semiconductors. I'm always looking for the data, and Tom showed the Envistat and the JSON data. Those, you cannot get the data that has not been heavily manipulated and altered, and it takes months to get the data after it should be available. And trying to find current data on all of these things, like outgoing long-wave radiation from the top of the atmosphere, those things are so heavily filtered, and now they're interpolated where they say that they have data from measured at the top of the atmosphere from 1948. And how do they do that? But they're showing it there, and that's the data that they're putting out there now. And it seems that more and more the data is heavily filtered before we can even get access to it for our analysis on it. And this is where you guys, with NASA, should be able to help free the data so we can see it.
Well, we're actually not within the government anymore. Our relationship with NASA is probably more than 20 years ago. Or more. But I understand your problem. And for example, the data that Dr. Abdelati was using in his Senate testimony had the GIA correction in it the other day. So when I wrote that Senate committee, I asked them to bring Dr. Abdelati back and ask him to explain that data, which was not sea level data. It was something else that had been corrected for something. And I just want to get the word out there that, yeah, this data is being filtered.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
This is
Tom.
going to be a quick answer. The University of Colorado is working as a NASA contractor. Go to their website, and they will show you the sea level charts. The trouble is they have the GIA built in, but they tell you that you can manually remove it if you'd like. They're not making it easy for you. But the data is out there. You can get it. So you'll find it, I hope.
We've about run out of time. Was there one last question? Here's one last question.
This is just a suggestion about scientific societies. They usually have newsletters, and you might try to have a newsletter that has, for example, co-editors, which has one of the co-editors taking one side, the other co-editor taking another side of the issue of AGW. It works in the New England section of the American Physical Society. Since the fall of 2007, there have been letters to the editor and contributions by people in the climate community, such as Fred Singer and Ross McKittrick. And other scientific societies might find that useful to take this same kind of approach.
Yeah, no, good point, and let's hope that can happen. Thank you, folks, for coming. Thank you, Heartland, for having us.
How about one strong round of applause for our speakers, true American heroes. Thank you very much.